So in most fighting games, characters usually have super moves, basically moves that are very powerful, but you gotta build up. Most of the time via a meter that slowly fills as you hit attacks or something. By the time the third game in this series, Super Smash Bros. Brawl, hit the scene, the developers thought it would be a cool marketing gimmick, idea, to include them in the game. Every character ended up getting one of these super moves, in the form of a Final Smash, which you get by breaking a Smash Ball, an item that would occasionally show up and fly around. Yeah, they didn't get the idea to actually put it on a meter until 10 years later in the currently newest Smash game. Speaking of Ultimate, Final Smashes are still around obviously, even though the roster is over twice as big as the one in Brawl. That's a lot of unique Final Smashes to create, right? Right? Yeah. So I thought it would be fun to go over every Final Smash in the series and explain their origins. Some characters have had their Final Smashes changed once or twice since Brawl, so I'll have to talk about 2 or even 3 different Final Smashes for a few characters. In October of 2021, I started a 5-episode series where I went over every character's Final Smash, and what you're watching right now is a big compilation of those 5 videos put together. And instead of just simply stitching them all together and calling it a day, I went back to a lot of Final Smashes to fix some mistakes and give some more info, along with cutting out all the intros, outros, references to previous entries, editing mistakes, sponsorship segments, all that good stuff. So see this as sort of a definitive edition of that series. There are a lot of Final Smashes to go over, around 110 give or take, depends on who you ask. And also because there are so many, I won't be spending too much time on each character. Hopefully. Starting with the main man himself, of course, who has surprisingly had the same one since Brawl, Mario's Final Smash is Mario Finale, which doesn't actually have a direct origin. We're off to a good start. Obviously, it's based on Mario's ability to shoot fireballs, which he first started doing since the original Super Mario Bros. From 1985, but I've seen a lot of people say that this Final Smash might come from Super Mario RPG Legend of the 7 Stars. Personally, I don't think so. First of all, the 2 attacks don't share the same name at all, and secondly, in that game, the many big fireballs he shoots bounce on the floor once before jumping to the enemy, and in Smash, 2 fireballs that get bigger and bigger spin around each other in the air. Not very similar at all. It might not have a clear origin, but it's still pretty cool in my opinion. I just think they could have done something more unique for Mario, you know? Next up is Donkey Kong, our first character to have had their Final Smash changed at one point. In Brawl and Smash 4, he had Konga Beat, which is a reference to the actual real-life GameCube controller that looks like a set of bongos, the DK bongos, which released alongside the rhythm game Donkey Konga for GameCube. However, this game and the controller are most likely a reference themselves, namely to an ability Donkey Kong has in Donkey Kong 64, where he jams out on a set of wooden bongos. The design of the UI that appears over his head, which only appears in Smash 4 by the way, is lifted straight from Donkey Konga, and him clapping is also something you gotta do in the game for some notes. Quick fun fact about the bongos by the way, if you have them and also a GameCube controller adapter, you can actually use them in Smash Ultimate. You can't move though, or do directional inputs. So maybe that's not the best idea. His new and heavily improved Final Smash from Ultimate is Jungle Rush. He ditches the bongos, but the attack comes from a game that originally still used them, namely Donkey Kong Jungle Beat for the GameCube. The attack itself is based on how Donkey Kong attacks in said game, which is just by wildly throwing punches around like a maniac. Whenever you hit the finishing blow on a boss, the colors on screen invert for a short bit, which is also what happens in Smash, except it's when you land the initial hit instead of the last one. And now it's time for me to complain about Triforce Slash, which was Link's Final Smash in Brawl and Smash 4. This is one of those Final Smashes that is completely made up by the Smash team. It has no origin at all in the Legend of Zelda series. The Triforce obviously comes from the series, but Link never did this. He's never put an enemy in between a Triforce and a secondary see-through Triforce and then went absolutely ham on them with sword slashes until he made the Triforces explode. I've seen people claim that this is a reference to the 4-hit combo he does on Ganon at the end of Ocarina of Time after being stunned by Zelda's magical powers, but again, I really don't see it. It's just random sword slashes. So yeah, I kinda hate this Final Smash. They could have definitely done something a lot cooler for Twilight Princess Link. There's a lot of potential there. Luckily, when Link was remodeled in Smash Ultimate to have his Breath of the Wild appearance, he also got a new Final Smash, namely Ancient Bow and Arrow. As the name implies, he shoots an ancient arrow from the ancient bow. Both of these items come of course from the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. The ancient bow can be created at the ancient tech lab in the Akkala region, along with the ancient arrows. The bow itself isn't all too special, it can shoot really far though, which is pretty cool. But the real star of the show are the ancient arrows. They can obliterate almost any enemy in the game with one hit, including the famous guardians if you hit them in their glowing eye. These arrows can be quite costly to make in the game, so you almost never use them, but when you do they're very effective, thus being perfect Final Smash material in my opinion. Now Samus's Final Smash is pretty interesting. It never actually changed, but something about it has been altered in the past. Originally, after using this huge laser, her power suit would fall apart and she would turn into Zero Suit Samus. When Smash 4 came around, the game's director, Masahiro Sakurai, didn't want transformation characters to be able to transform mid-match anymore, so Zero Suit Samus and Sheik became their own separate characters, and Squirtle and Ivysaur were just completely killed off. Now as for the move's origins, there is none. This is again a move completely unique to Smash Bros. There have been times in the Metroid series where Samus would get all mega powered up and shoot some devastating stuff, like at the end of Super Metroid for example, but it's never been called Zero Laser, and it's also never been a giant straight blue beam. It's a really cool looking Final Smash though. Big ending spoilers for Metroid Dread ahead. There will be a small handful of spoiler warnings in this video, but if you don't want to see this one specifically, please skip to the timestamp shown on screen. There's your warning, 3, 2, 1. Now, why am I talking about a game that released after the currently newest Smash game? Because some people have speculated that the Hyper Beam you get at the end of the game, when you acquire the Metroid suit, is inspired by her now 14-year-old Final Smash Zero Laser. A beam called Hyper Beam has appeared a couple of times before in Metroid, like at the end of Super Metroid, where it appears as individual rainbow lasers, but in Dread specifically, it functions like a gigantic, continuous beam that you just hold down instead of firing rounds, like how it works in Smash. It is also by far the most overpowering attack she's ever had access to in the series, so it would be pretty fitting if it was indeed based on her Final Smash. Who knows, maybe in a future Smash game they'll go all out on this possible connection. Dark Samus's Final Smash is maybe made up? Because she's a clone of Samus, both literally and figuratively, they just gave her the same Final Smash as Samus. It just looks a tiny bit different and is called Face-On Laser instead of Zero Laser. Now the reason I say it's maybe made up is because in one of the fights against Dark Samus in Metroid Prime 2, she actually uses an attack on you that's just a big beam of Face-On. Maybe the devs looked at this for inspiration, but probably not. They most likely just copy-pasted Samus's Final Smash onto her. In Brawl and Smash 4, Yoshi's Final Smash was Super Dragon, which was based on two of Yoshi's abilities he had in his debut game, Super Mario World, when holding a specific colored Koopa shell in his mouth. For example, he could spit a red shell out as some fireballs, and if you found a blue shell, you could fly around. The Final Smash is likely based on a combination of these two abilities. In Ultimate, his new Final Smash is Stampede, which is a Smash original move. However, it's not from Ultimate. It actually comes from the opening cutscene of Melee. In said opening movie, he and a whole army of Yoshis run across the screen in some deserty area, and the small cutscene in Ultimate also takes place in a desert-like arena. The camera angles used are pretty much the same as in Melee as well. Kirby is our first character to have a Final Smash that was changed in Smash 4 and kept in Ultimate. Originally it was Cook Kirby, which is simply based on a copy ability he has. First introduced in Kirby Superstar, he would spawn a cook pot and drag every enemy currently on screen into it, to cook them alive and turn them into food. Very barbaric. And yeah, it worked basically the same in Smash, except any item can come out based on your item settings, instead of only food, though usually it is food. In Smash 4, he got a redesigned Final Smash in the form of Ultra Sword, which is a reference to the main gimmick of Kirby's Return to Dreamland. In said game, Kirby could occasionally use an Ultra form of some copy abilities, and the Ultra form of the Sword ability is this huge blade. Whenever you get to use this ability in a stage, he always just swings it once in front of him and that's it, unlike in Smash where it's a flurry of attacks if you manage to hit your target. But in Return to Dreamland, there's a select few times where you get to use this ability in a boss fight, and if you use it to finish off said bosses, Kirby adds on a big flurry of attacks with the Ultra Sword. Small spoilers ahead for Kirby's Return to Dreamland. I normally wouldn't give a warning for this since the game is 12 years old, but it has a recently released remake, so a lot of people may be playing through it for the first time, you know. Anyway, skip to this timestamp to avoid it. 3, 2, 1. Against Magolor specifically, the final boss of the game's story mode, Kirby grows the Ultra Sword extra large for the final hit of his flurry of attacks, which he also does in Smash, albeit at a much smaller scale, so that's probably where that comes from. It's a shame that in Smash the sword doesn't take on a bunch of different appearances during this flurry though. Fox's Brawl in Smash 4 Final Smash is Landmaster, basically a giant tank with the ability to fly for a short bit that you can freely control. The Landmaster originates from Star Fox 64, where it was used in a couple of land-based stages instead of the traditional R-Wing. I don't really have much more to say about this Final Smash, so instead I'll just show you this. That's pretty funny. Moving on to his ultimate Final Smash, Team Star Fox. This is just simply based on Fox's crew in his home series. Each one of the 4 members of Star Fox comes in and attacks the targets with lasers from their R-Wings, which includes of course Fox McCloud, Sleepy Toad, Peppy Hare, and Falco Lombardi. So I guess you can make him attack himself if you use this Final Smash on him. The reference is pretty much just that, Fox's crew. He's the leader and this formation attack is just kind of him commanding his gang to fire at will. Pikachu is our first character whose Final Smash has changed in terms of function, but not in terms of origin or name. His Final Smash is Volt Tackle. In Brawl and Smash 4, this made him turn into a giant big ball of electricity to fly around freely, and in Ultimate, he just dashes around the enemy at lightning speed while also being surrounded by bolts of lightning. In the Pokemon games, this is the signature attack of the Pichu family, meaning only Pichu, Pikachu, and Raichu can use it. When it was first introduced in Generation 3, the only way to learn it was to leave a female Pikachu or Raichu holding a light ball in the daycare together with any male Pokemon in the field or fairy egg group. If you do this, the 2 Pokemon will eventually play Uno together, which will somehow produce a baby Pichu that knows Volt Tackle. And for what the move does, it's basically what you see in Smash Bros, a lightning fast dash towards the enemy while the user encodes themselves in lightning. The only big difference here is that it does some recoil damage in Pokemon, but not in Smash. At least not with Pikachu's Final Smash. Wink wink. Luigi in Brawl had the infamous Negative Zone Final Smash, where he does a weird dance accompanied by weird music, which would make everyone around him get random effects. As you may have probably guessed, this Final Smash has no direct origin, but it's based on Luigi's whole existence as a character, quote unquote living in his brother's shadow. You know, with Luigi starting out as just a palette swap of Mario and being the younger brother of the most famous face in gaming, the move is even just straight up called Negative Zone. The reason we know this is its origin is because the trophy description for this Final Smash straight up says that this technique comes from living in his brother's shadow. How he managed to learn how to do this from that, I have no idea. This is just a bizarre idea for an attack. I missed it though, it was funny. He got a way more fitting Final Smash in Smash 4 though, namely the Poltergust 5000, the vacuum cleaner he uses in Luigi's Mansion, Dark Moon specifically. There's never actually a point in that game where his vacuum gets ultra powerful and he sucks with the power of a tornado like this, but in Smash Ultimate, he got a new Final Smash? It's literally the same thing, but he uses the Poltergust G00 now, from Luigi's Mansion 3, and in that game, there is a moment where his vacuum does basically what it does in Smash. Although this obviously came before this, so maybe Smash Bros inspired Luigi's Mansion instead of the other way around. In short terms, this Final Smash is also made up. Ness's Final Smash is PK's Starstorm, where he uses his magical powers to attack with giant magic things, basically causing a meteor shower. Now this move does indeed come from Earthbound, Ness's origin game, but ironically Ness doesn't learn this move. It's instead his last party member, Pooh, that learns it, and thus can use it in battle. The description for this Final Smash's trophy in Brawl states that Pooh may have taught Ness this move at some point, specifically for Brawl, so that's pretty cool. At least they come up with something clever to explain this. 2 games later in Smash Ultimate, they added Ness's party members, Paula and Pooh, to the background, so him being there makes a little more sense now, even though it's still clearly Ness who's performing the attack. Another cool detail is that the animated background that shows up in the background is based on the 8 Melodies cutscene from Earthbound. Captain Falcon's Final Smash is just straight up him running someone over with his iconic, ultra-fast racing vehicle, the Blue Falcon. I'm pretty sure he never actually tries to run someone over in F-Zero, but he's a professional racer in his games, so that's where the idea for this Final Smash came from. The area this takes place on is in Port Town, Captain Falcon's hometown no less, and the sound effect you hear when using this attack is the same as the sound of the racers pulling up to the start of the racetrack in the original F-Zero. Jigglypuff's awful Final Smash, Puff Up, in which they grow huge for a moment, isn't actually a move in a Pokemon game. The idea for this Final Smash simply comes from the fact that Jigglypuff is the balloon Pokemon according to the Pokédex. So a Final Smash where they inflate themselves to be very big is fitting and likely why they came up with this. Ironically enough, years after Jigglypuff's introduction and this Final Smash, Pokemon Sword and Shield introduced a mechanic called Dynamaxing, in which your Pokemon can grow huge and do battle like that for 3 turns. And even more ironic is that Jigglypuff wasn't even in that game until a while after, via the DLC. Talk about a missed opportunity, initially. Peach's final smash is Peach Blossom, where she dances around while putting opponents to sleep and making a bunch of peaches rain down that you can eat to recover some damage you've taken. Starting with Smash 4, only 3 Peaches appear now, but they are significantly bigger than standard Peaches, each healing 20% damage. This move is also unique to Smash Bros, but Peach has had the ability to put enemies to sleep before in Super Mario RPG again, with her magic spell, Sleepy Time, although it doesn't make giant Peaches appear or anything, and instead causes a lot of sheep to show up. The artwork that shows up is inspired by the DS game Super Princess Peach, which came out a couple years before Brawl. The drawings got a visual upgrade or downgrade depending on who you ask in Smash 4, which they kept in Ultimate. The music that plays during this final smash is a sped up remix of the Coin Heaven song from Super Mario Bros. 3. Now Daisy's final smash is the same thing, because yeah, boring Echo Fighter with nothing unique to them. She makes big edible daisy flowers appear instead of peaches. That can be good for you. Though apparently there are some breeds of daisies that are edible, but I still wouldn't go around randomly eating flowers you see out in the wild. Anyways, this final smash makes no sense for Daisy since she's never had the ability to put people to sleep in a game. Unless we're talking about her ability to put me to sleep with her inclusion and moveset in this game. Let's move on. Bowser's final smash is a Smash original, and definitely the most famous of them. He transforms into Giga Bowser, which you could originally control for a little while. I've gone over this in a past video, but Giga Bowser is actually a Smash original character, since he's never appeared in a Mario game, originating instead from the end portion of Adventure Mode in Super Smash Bros. Melee, where once you've defeated Bowser, he comes back in the form of this huge beast. Masahiro Sakurai has stated in the past that the idea of Giga Bowser came from how he interpreted Bowser's original 8-bit sprite, as a giant scary monster, instead of the softer, more gentle looking villain he is in the Mario franchise. In Ultimate, he still transforms into Giga Bowser, but instead of being able to control him freely, he instead floats in the background for a bit, and you can throw one giant punch at the stage. Ice Climbers' final smash is based on the idea of what the Ice Climbers are all about, scaling a big icy mountain. In Ultimate, their final smash was slightly tweaked by now spinning around, being slightly able to control it, and a condor now appearing at the top that you can grab onto. This condor in Ice Climber served the purpose of being the end goal you can grab onto. Sheik's final smash in Brawl in Smash 4 was Light Arrow, where she shoots a light arrow forward. In the only mainline Zelda game where Sheik is in, Ocarina of Time, she's never actually shown using light arrows, or even a bow for that matter. But spoilers, Sheik is Zelda, and Zelda gives Link the light arrows at the end of the game. The design itself comes from Twilight Princess, where Zelda creates the bow and the light arrows. Zelda has the exact same final smash in both games, cause you know, same character, even though you couldn't swap between them anymore in Smash 4, so I guess they just got lazy. Like I said, Zelda is heavily tied to the light arrows in the whole series. She originally used them at the end of Wind Waker, she also uses them in Twilight Princess after she creates them, she gives you the bow of light and light arrows at the end of A Link Between Worlds, and so on. So it's very fitting for this to be her ultimate move in Smash Bros. Both of them got a new final smash in Ultimate. Sheik got Sheikah Dance, a very flashy move that starts with an attack using her dagger. Sheik actually does basically nothing at all in Ocarina of Time, so you never ever see her fighting, let alone with a dagger. I think the idea of this move just comes from the fact that she's a ninja character, which usually attack in fast rapid strikes. This is also her fighting style in the spin-off game Hyrule Warriors, so some people have actually theorized that this final smash is based on that, and that could very well be the case. While the dagger doesn't actually show up at all in Ocarina of Time, it is in this piece of official artwork for the game, and it's also on her back in the unused Sheik design in Twilight Princess, which she was actually made to look like in Brawl and Smash 4. And Zelda's new final smash is Triforce of Wisdom, which a lot of people claim is the best final smash in the game. And I'm gonna have to agree. Anyways, in the Zelda lore is an ancient artifact called the Triforce, which I really don't have time to explain in full detail right now, so I'll just give you a quick rundown. The Triforce was created by 3 goddesses and consists of 3 parts. The Triforce of Power, which is the top one and Ganondorf is the holder of, the Triforce of Courage, which Link holds and is the right one, and the Triforce of Wisdom, which, as you may have guessed, Zelda is the holder of and is the left one. The Triforce of Power gives Ganondorf immense strength amongst other things. The Triforce of Courage gives Link the power of being the main character, and the Triforce of Wisdom gives Zelda, plot convenience. Okay, but for real, Zelda has the power of sealing in a lot of games, because of her Triforce, and she uses it many times to seal Ganon or Ganondorf. and this is pretty much what her final smash is based on. She just seals her opponent with it. Dr. Mario's final smash is Dr. Finale, and yeah, it has no direct origin. Again. With Dr. Mario being a clone of Mario, even though he's not considered an Echo Fighter, he just gets the same final smash as Mario, except visually different. Instead of shooting fireballs, he shoots two big Mega Vitamins, which if you know anything about Dr. Mario, you know that the Mega Vitamins are the things you move around in his origin game. This final smash is just lazy in my opinion. Why not have him drop a lot of vitamins on someone, since that's what he does in his game. Anyways, Pichu's final smash is Full Tackle, the same thing as Pikachu's. So since I don't want to spend too much time repeating myself this video, I'll keep this short. Full Tackle is the signature move of the Pichu family in Pokemon, meaning only Pichu, Pikachu, and Raichu can learn it. It's basically what you see in Smash, a lightning quick dash towards the enemy, in which the user encodes themselves in lightning. The only interesting thing to point out here is that Pichu actually takes recoil damage from his final smash, like with most of his specials. Like I said earlier, it's actually also what the move does in Pokemon. But it doesn't happen with Pikachu in Smash, only Pichu, so if you want to be a nerd about it, Pichu's final smash is more accurate to its origin than Pikachu's. Falco's final smash in Brawl and Smash 4 was Landmaster, the same final smash as Fox, meaning it's also based on the same thing. Falco's Landmaster is actually on average a little weaker than Fox's, but it has better jump height and air movement in general to make up for it. Anyways, like I said earlier, it's based on the flying tank you can sometimes use in Star Fox 64. Another thing I can mention is that Falco actually hates the Landmaster in Star Fox 64, which is why he says,
"Personally, I prefer the air,"
when activating his final smash. Luckily, he got a final smash update in Ultimate, that being Team Star Fox. The same thing as Fox's final smash. The only difference is that when Falco does it, he spins around while shooting lasers, and in the ending it zooms in on presumably Falco's R-Wing instead of showing them all from a distance. Marth's final smash is Critical Hit. If you've ever played any RPG, I probably don't have to explain what a critical hit is. I mean, it's even a mechanic in Smash Brothers. In the Fire Emblem franchise, they play a big role though, since in all the games you can see the chance of landing a critical hit before you actually attack, meaning you can strategize around them, and this is a big part of the gameplay. So much so that when you pull it off, it's always accompanied by a flashy animation. So it makes sense that this would be Marth's final smash. The big health bar you see being depleted is just that. Health bars from Fire Emblem are often represented by many lines next to each other, all being one hit point, so that's where the design in Smash comes from. Lucina's final smash is, wow, who would have guessed, also critical hit, the same thing as Marth. So yeah, it's based on the same thing, that's really all I can say about it. So let's just move on. Young Link's final smash, Triforce Slash. Remember Link's stupid final smash from Brawl and Smash 4? Yeah, they gave it to Young Link in Ultimate. I already explained that this move has no absolute origin at all, and that the Triforce is basically the all-powerful magical MacGuffin item from the Legend of Zelda franchise. When they first announced that Link got a new final smash in this game, I was hopeful that they realized this final smash is stupid and that young Link would get something cool. Because I don't know if you've played Majora's Mask, but there is so much potential in it. Like, why not have his final smash use the Omega Powerful Fierce Dedede Mask transformation, which you only get after almost fully completing the game. Anyways, long story short, this final smash is based on nothing and it's stupid. Sorry for getting off track there. Let's just move on to Ganondorf's final smash, which in Brawl and Smash 4 was Beast Ganon. Ganondorf transforms into the giant beast known as Ganon, slams the ground, and then runs forward, trampling anyone in his way. Ganondorf's design in Brawl and Smash 4 was from Twilight Princess, so it makes sense that the Ganon design also comes from that game. The fight against Ganon in Twilight Princess involves him constantly running at you, which is pretty much what he does in Smash. In Ultimate, he didn't actually really get a new final smash, it just got a new name, that being Ganon, the Demon King. His design is now from Ocarina of Time, and so is Ganon's design. Instead of stomping the ground in front of him, he now slashes his two golden swords in front of him and then dashes forward. So yeah, pretty much the same thing. Fun fact, Ganon is actually Ganondorf's original form, and usually how he's at his strongest, so I'm a big fan of this final smash. Mewtwo's final smash is Side Strike, which just like Pikachu's final smash is their signature move in Pokemon. It was introduced in Generation 5, and Mewtwo used to only learn it by reaching level 100, but they changed it to level 72 in Generation 8 onwards. But since Smash Ultimate, the currently newest Smash game, released during Generation 7 of Pokemon, this indirectly confirms that Mewtwo in Smash is level 100, which is kinda interesting. Anyways, Mewtwo transforms into Mega Mewtwo Y during this final smash, which is one of their 2 Mega Evolutions, specifically the one you obtain by playing Pokemon Y instead of X. They can perform this move without Mega Evolving in Pokemon, so it's just a neat touch in Smash Bros. Mewtwo is also one of only 2 Pokemon in the entire series that has 2 different Mega Evolutions. Wow, what an honor. As for why they transform into Mega Mewtwo Y specifically and not X, we don't know, but it might be because in that form they get a 40-point increase to their special attack, making it a whopping 194, which is the highest of any Pokemon. And since Side Strike is a special attack, the Final Smash would theoretically benefit from this. Moving on to Roy's Final Smash, it's... you gotta be kidding me. It's Critical Hit, just like Marth and Lucina. Which hey, is good for me, means I don't have to talk about it for too long. Well, actually it's not like Marth and Lucina, because unlike their Final Smash, this one isn't a one-hit KO move for some reason, even though it has a way smaller hitbox since Roy doesn't dash forwards. Well, to be fair, it can hit behind him, which counts for something I guess. I do really like this Final Smash though, because the animation for it is super satisfying, and it actually comes pretty much directly from Fire Emblem The Binding Blade, which is also cool. Next up, though Chrom may be Roy's Echo Fighter, his Final Smash is surprisingly not Critical Hit, but instead is Awakening Aether. In the Fire Emblem series, Aether is a skill that's been a thing since Path of Radiance, which you may know as the game Ike is from, and Chrom can learn this skill in Awakening. Interestingly enough, there is no skill called Awakening Aether, even though that's what his Final Smash is officially called. My guess is that they added Awakening to it because he's from Fire Emblem Awakening, and to make it not have the exact same name as Ike's Up Special. Anyways, the animation of him hitting once, jumping backwards, and then hitting again comes directly from the Aether animation from FE Awakening. Mr. Game & Watch's Final Smash is Octopus, where he transforms into an octopus, and you can freely move around as him and attack opponents by extending your tentacles. In Ultimate, they changed this Final Smash to instead have him quickly fly across the screen in this form, grabbing anyone in his way and dragging them into the blast zone. Either way, they're both based on the same thing, and that being the Game & Watch handheld game called Octopus, which is what you're looking at right now. In this game, you don't actually play as the titular octopus, but instead a group of random deep-sea treasure divers. You lose this game by touching any of the octopus's tentacles, at which point it will grab a hold of you and not let go, which is exactly what Mr. Game & Watch does in Ultimate when he grabs you during this Final Smash. Another cool touch in Ultimate is that during this Final Smash, the background of the stage changes to resemble the background of a Game & Watch handheld system, which is pretty cool. Meta Knight's Final Smash is actually a really interesting case, in many different ways. First of all, the move itself was completely made up in Brawl, but it did appear in a Kirby game 8 years later in Kirby Planet Robobot. By that time Smash 4 was already out, in which he has the same Final Smash. Another thing is the name of the move. Galaxian is the name of Meta Knight's sword, but at the time of Brawl's release, his sword had yet to be named in one of the Kirby games, but it was already named in the animated TV show Kirby Right Back At Ya. So the name of this attack didn't come from a video game, but instead from an animated TV series, which is pretty interesting. The sword would continue to go unnamed in the games until Kirby's Epic Yarn 2 years later. His new Final Smash from Ultimate, Darkness Illusion, is also made up for Smash Bros. However, it does resemble a move he uses in Kirby Star Allies during Meta Knight's boss fight. It doesn't start with the pose he does in Smash, instead starting with a big uppercut slice, but it does feature him constantly teleporting around his enemy, whom is thrown in the air, while he attacks them from all different angles. When I first talked about this Final Smash in part 2 of my original Final Smash Origin series, I said that it wouldn't surprise me if they ended up making it canon in a future Kirby game, like what they did with his Brawl and Smash 4 Final Smash, and at the time, Kirby and the Forgotten Lands wasn't out yet. Upon release of that game, I got a few comments and messages saying that they indeed ended up putting Darkness Illusion in that game. But that move is actually called Upper Caliber, which is the same move used in Star Allies, so it's not Darkness Illusion. Still wouldn't surprise me if they did end up using this move in an actual future Kirby game though. That all said, the initiator hit of this Final Smash kind of resembles what it looks like when you give Meta Knight the Zap Sword in Kirby Star Allies, or you may even say it looks like the up thrust attack, but at that point I feel like we're reaching a bit. And then again, Meta Knight has never grown an extra pair of wings in the Kirby series, which is what happens during this Final Smash. So in my opinion, Darkness Illusion is a completely made up Smash Brothers move, at least for the time being. Anyways, on to Pit, who is our first and one of only 4 characters in Ultimate to have had their Final Smash changed in every Smash game to date that had Final Smashes. His first Final Smash in Brawl was Palutena's Army, in which a render of Palutena shows up in the background, while a ton of Centurions swarm the stage and attack the opponents. In the first Kid Icarus game, all Centurions, who are basically standard rank soldiers of Palutena's army, were turned to stone, and Pit can save them by hitting them with a hammer. And if you do so, up to 3 of them will help you out in the following boss fight. In Smash 4, Pit's moveset was redesigned to be based on the newly released Kid Icarus Uprising, which was actually very based on his appearance in Brawl, because both games are directed by the same guy. His new final smash ended up being the 3 Sacred Treasures, which are made up of the Arrow of Light, Mirror Shield, and Wings of Pegasus, even though in Smash and Kid Icarus Uprising, his wings look the same and he gets an armor set instead. And lastly, his new final smash in Ultimate is the Lightning Chariot, which has him board the chariot in question and ram into the opponent with it. It comes from chapter 19 of Kid Icarus Uprising. During this part of the story, Palutena is possessed by an entity known as the Chaos King, and has put a giant impenetrable barrier around Palutena's temple, where the possessed Palutena resides. To get through this barrier, Pit goes to the Lightning Chariot base, and after getting to the top, the Chariot Master challenges him to a race in which both him and Pit use one of the 2 unicorns that normally operate the chariot. After defeating him in this friendly race, he dies, and entrusts Pit with the chariot and both unicorns, who are named Foss and Lux. And after using them and the chariot, he rams right through the force field around Palutena's temple, breaking it and allowing him entry. So yeah, this lightning fast ram is probably what they based the final smash on, and Pit yelling this,
Boss! Lux! Let's go!
is just him calling out the names of the 2 unicorns. Quick fun fact, they're named after the Greek and Latin words for light respectively. That has nothing to do with the origin, but I thought it was a neat detail. So Pit has a lot of cool stuff and origins in his final smashes, right? So what did they give Dark Pit for his final smash? Dark Pit Staff. Yeah. The Dark Pit Staff is just one of 108 unique weapons in Kid Icarus Uprising, and it's a staff, which means it has a very long range. There are plenty of weapons in the game that are named after characters, like the Palutena Blade, Druidi Claws, and Arlon Orbiters, just to name 3. Dark Pit Staff is obviously named after Dark Pit, which might be the sole reason why they made this his final smash, which would be stupid. But it's more likely based on the fact that in Kid Icarus Uprising, one of the segments where it's possible to encounter him in the land section of chapter 6, in which he is still an enemy, he uses the Dark Pit Staff to try and snipe you from the top of a cliff. You can't really see it from here, but trust me, he's using the Dark Pit Staff. Anyways, this final smash is stupid. Dark Pit as a whole is just a giant mountain of missed potential, which includes his final smash, so let's just move on. Zero Suit Samus is our next character, and just like Pit, she's had a different final smash in every game she's in. Remember how I said in Brawl, after Samus' final smash, her suit falls apart and she turns into Zero Suit Samus? Well, as a complete opposite of that, Zero Suit Samus' final smash is called Power Suit Samus. And as the name implies, it involves her putting her suit back on and turning back into regular Samus. Now this move is a Smash Bros original, so it has no direct origin, but it bears a strong resemblance to the incredibly obscure ability from Super Metroid called Crystal Flash. This ability recovers all her health at the cost of a bunch of other resources, and during it, she can be seen floating in midair without her suit in a very similar pose as in her final smash, and the move ends with her putting her suit back on, so maybe this is what inspired her Brawl final smash. In Smash 4, her final smash was Gunship, in which she calls her Gunship, boards it, and then shoots at the battlefield from a cockpit view. She's had a gunship in many Metroid games, and this final smash is just simply based on it. It's pretty high-tech and can shoot lasers, and that's really all I can say about its origins. It's just Samus' spaceship. And her ultimate final smash is Zero Laser. Yeah, technically the same thing as regular Samus' final smash, though instead of shooting it in front of her, she hops on her gunship in the background and shoots it from there. She actually puts her power suit back on during this final smash, which makes sense since she wouldn't be able to use Zero Laser otherwise. But unlike Samus' version, it also includes a brief bigger blast at the end. One thing that's kind of a shame is that during this final smash, she always puts on her regular suit, so if you're using it against Samus with her default costume, there's 2 identical power suits on screen. It'd be cool if every alt of Zero Suit Samus used a different Samus costume. Or maybe it should be more like this. I guess that wouldn't make the situation where 2 of the same power suit appear on screen impossible. You know, whatever, it's not a big deal. Wario's final smash has him eating a raw, full garlic, turning him into the legendary Wario Man, and then dashing forwards to deliver a barrage of attacks to his opponents. In Brawl and Smash 4, this final smash was actually fun because you could play around as him and he had insane power and frame data. Basically, it made him the best character in the game for a short while. Anyways, Wario Man is Wario's alter ego in a few of the WarioWare games, and he first appeared in WarioWare Twisted for the Game Boy Advance, the second game in the series. There, he served as the final stage in the game's story mode, and the theme of this stage was that all microgames were based on Wario. Very classy. Man, this used to be like my favorite Final Smash ever. I even made a whole video about it back in the Smash 4 days when it was announced how lame his Final Smash would be in Ultimate. Well, let's just move on to Snake's Final Smashes. In Brawl, it was a simple grenade launcher in which he would get up real close and personal with the camera and shoot grenades at the stage and his opponents while hanging from a helicopter. The specific grenade launcher he uses here is the R.H. Allen RGB-6, which he ironically never uses in Metal Gear, but Raiden in Metal Gear Solid 2 does. Speaking of which, Snake has used many grenade launchers in his series, but this Final Smash seems to be based on a specific event in Metal Gear Solid 2, where he shoots an explosive from a helicopter in a cutscene. And in the following gameplay portion, you, playing as not Snake, try to shoot down a flying vehicle with a stinger, which is what the UI in Smash seems to be designed after. When Snake returned in Ultimate after being absent in Smash 4, his new Final Smash ended up being Covering Fire, in which he tossed a flare grenade in front of him and then a bunch of homing missiles blocked the stage, presumably coming from a helicopter. The mechanic of throwing a flare grenade to request air support comes from Metal Gear Peace Walker, and it was also in the Phantom Pain thanks to a special flare grenade a team called the Diamond Dogs developed for him. In that game, requesting air support this way causes a helicopter to rain down hellfire on the enemies below, unlike in Peace Walker where requesting air support just gives you some supplies dropped in a cardboard box. Needless to say, the idea for this Final Smash definitely comes from the Phantom Pain if it's not completely made up. Ike's Final Smash has never been changed, but that's fine because it's the incredibly iconic Great Ether, where he smashes his opponents upwards and then attacks them with a flaming blade a bunch of times before crashing back down with them into a big fiery explosion. This is yet another Final Smash with no direct origin, but Ether, the same skill we talked about when going over Chrom's Final Smash, is Ike's mastery skill in his 2 games. Quick spoiler warning for Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn ahead. It's a very old game, but hey, might as well give a quick heads up, right? Skip to this timestamp if you don't want to see it. 3, 2, 1. Like I said, the Final Smash has no direct origin, but it's been speculated to be based on the final hit he performs against the game's final boss, Ashera, during which the goddess Yune bestows some powers onto Ike that makes blue flames around him, which, starting with Smash 4, is also what happens in Smash Bros. Pokémon Trainer is a little bit interesting. His Final Smash in Brawl and Ultimate is Triple Finish, in which he commands all 3 of his Pokémon, Squirtle, Ivysaur, and Charizard, to attack at the same time. There's not actually a move called Triple Finish in any Pokémon game, but the idea of a trainer telling all of their Pokémon to attack in tandem is something you often see in the Pokémon universe, primarily in the anime. Squirtle performs Hydro Pump, Ivysaur does Solar Beam, and Charizard does a barrage of Fire Blasts, which are all some of the strongest moves of their respective types. The strongest actually prior to Generation 3. The Squirtle line and Bulbasaur line learn Hydro Pump and Solar Beam respectively through leveling up, and Charizard can learn Fire Blast only through the use of ATM. Ironically, at the time of Brawl's release, this would have been an illegal move since triple battles with 3 Pokemon at the same time, wouldn't be introduced until Generation 5, which released after Brawl. I'm sure I don't even have to explain this, but just in case, the "it's super effective" message appears in Pokemon games whenever you take advantage of your opponent's type weakness. For example, when you use a fire move against an ice-type Pokemon. The text box's design is based on whatever the most recent game was at the time. In Brawl, it looked like the boxes from Generation 4, and in Ultimate it's designed after the ones in Generation 7. Well, that took a while. Anyways, in Smash 4, Pokémon Trainer was cut and only Charizard remained playable, and their final Smash was Mega Charizard X. Remember how earlier I said that Mewtwo is one of 2 Pokemon with 2 Mega Evolutions? Yeah, Charizard is the other one. Why do they get this special treatment? Well, isn't it obvious? It's because they're both Gen 1 Pokemon. Whereas Mewtwo's Final Smash was based on the one from Pokemon Y, Charizard's is based on the one from Pokemon X, in which Charizard removes their Fire Flying type and instead becomes a Fire Dragon type. Anyways, he flies around in this Final Smash. He has access to 2 moves in this form, Dragon Rush and Fire Blast, which is the same move they used in their Brawl Final Smash, so I don't need to go over that again. Dragon Rush, however, is a very powerful Dragon type physical attack, as expected. The only way for Charizard to have access to this move is through breeding. Specifically, you need one of these Pokemon to be one of the parents and also know Dragon Rush. There's a little more to it than that, but I really don't have time to get into the specifics of Pokemon breeding right now. Anyways, if you do it successfully, a Charmander will be born with Dragon Rush already learned, and then you evolve it into a Charizard and BAM! You have a Charizard that knows Dragon Rush. And now you just have to transfer them to Pokemon X and give them the Charizard X, and BAM! You have a Mega Charizard X that can use Dragon Rush. Or you just play Smash 4 and get a Smash Ball. That works too. But whatever, let's move on to our next Final Smash that also flies around and shoots projectiles. Diddy Kong. In Brawl and Smash 4, his Final Smash was Rocket Barrel Barrage, which has him whipping out a jetpack called the Rocket Barrel Pack and fly around while shooting a ton of peanuts all over the place. Thankfully, this move has an insanely simple origin, coming directly from Donkey Kong 64. In that game, he was able to do exactly this after jumping out of a barrel. The only real difference is that it's called Rocket Barrel Boost instead of Barrage, but other than that, it's literally the same move. In Ultimate, he got a new Final Smash in the form of Hyper Rocket Barrel. This move has never actually appeared in a Donkey Kong game and is simply just based on his Rocket Jetpack, which did originate from Donkey Kong 64, much like his previous Final Smash. The only real interesting thing to note here is that the actual jetpack he uses in this attack looks completely different, as it's now metallic and one single color, instead of the wooden jetpack he used previously and in his up special. Lucas's Final Smash is the same as Ness's, PK Starstorm. I mean, it functions a little differently, but we're covering the origins in this video, not how they work exactly. Either way, they still both make these things rain down. In Mother 3, the game Lucas is from, PK Starstorm is a PSI ability that's just really powerful, and just like with Ness, Lucas doesn't actually learn this move in his game. Instead, one of his party members does, namely Kumatora. She learns this move by getting hit by a lightning bolt, and then she's just perfectly fine and knows how to perform PK Starstorm, which, as the name implies, makes a bunch of stars appear on screen, which is sort of what it does in Smash. Those look like meteors to me, but sure, they can be stars. And again, just like with Ness, the description of Lucas's Final Smash trophy in Brawl states that Kumatora taught Lucas this ability when they learned he would be in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. And in Ultimate, Kumatora just straight up appears beside him during this attack, which is a super cool detail. Sonic's Final Smash is the very iconic Super Sonic. In Brawl and Smash 4, this was a transformation Final Smash, meaning you could freely control Sonic during it, and in Ultimate, it was changed to just have him zip around the screen lightning fast. Either way, both are obviously based on the same thing, that being the completion reward of Sonic the Hedgehog 2. In that game, if you clear all bonus stages and collect all Chaos Emeralds, you can freely turn into Super Sonic, granted you have enough rings to maintain that form. Super Sonic then went on to become a major part of the whole Sonic franchise, appearing in games even today, and pretty much always via the same method of having all Chaos Emeralds. Sonic is known for going fast, and this form just makes him even faster, along with making him invincible and giving him cool hair. Now before we move on, I know I said I wasn't going to talk too much about the functionality of the Final Smashes in these videos, but I really want to mention Super Sonic real quick, because this Final Smash is awful. It barely does damage at all if you hit it, and there's a cap to how high you can go, so if you get hit at the top, which will pretty much never KO with how weak the hits are, you can just stay up there for a bit to time out this incredibly short Final Smash. Anyways, let's move on to King Dedede, who is our third of 4 characters to have had their Final Smashes changed in every Smash game they are in. His first Final Smash in Brawl was Waddle Dee Army, in which he summons a bunch of Waddle Dees, Waddle Doos, and a few Gordos. As his name implies, King Dedede is a king, a self-proclaimed one at that. Either way, he has an army under him in the Kirby games, made up of these creatures. Waddle Dees are your standard ranked soldiers who aren't all too special, and Waddle Doos are basically the exact same except they have one giant eyeball that they can shoot a small beam out of, which they occasionally do in Brawl too. And Gordos are just random Kirby enemies? I don't know, they're more like obstacles. Anyways, they don't really serve under Dedede like the Waddle Dees and Doos, but I guess he just feels like summoning them in Brawl, which he can also randomly do with his side special in this game. In Smash 4, he had the incredibly lame Dedede Burst as his Final Smash. It was likely changed from Brawl because the 3DS version wouldn't have been able to handle all those Waddle Dees on screen. Anyways, this attack is mostly made up. I mean, he inhales at the start, which is definitely an ability he's had before, and he's also used bombs on a few occasions like in a minigame in Kirby's Adventure. But he's never done this: suck enemies in, spin around a few times with his hammer, and then spawn a big bomb from his hammer. The bomb itself has a skull insignia on it, which bears a close resemblance to the bomber enemies from the series, but even then I don't think this Final Smash has much of an origin at all, and it's just kinda lame in my opinion. Luckily, his new and improved Final Smash in Ultimate is DD Rush. The name is made up, but that's fine because this Final Smash is just awesome. He turns into Masked Dedede, which is really just him putting on a mask, slams you against some cage walls, fires missiles at you, and then does this very hard hammer attack in your face against that cage. While what he does exactly in Smash is made up, all the elements of this attack are straight up from Kirby Superstar Ultra, which is also Masked Dedede's debut game. You fight him in a cage of some sorts in that game. He has an attack where he shoots homing missiles from his hammer, and he has a move where he spins around really fast while swinging his hammer around him. This Final Smash is just so cool in my opinion, and it makes perfect sense for a boss character's ultimate attack to be based on one of their boss fights in their original series. Olimar's final smash is End of Day, in which he just straight up ditches the fight in his spaceship, and then comes crashing back down in a gigantic explosion. This is based on one of the main mechanics of the Pikmin series. The games are structured by in-game days, and at the end of each day, Olimar boards his ship and leaves the planet's surface, because at night, dangerous nocturnal creatures come out that would attack him and his Pikmin otherwise. If you leave any Pikmin behind at the end of a day, you can see them just barely not escape with you as they get eaten alive, and this is what you see happen to your opponent at the bottom of the screen during this final smash. Yeah, Pikmin is a pretty brutal game actually. The crash landing that happens at the end of the final smash isn't actually an attack he does in Pikmin, that would be silly, but he does crash land a lot in the series, so that's probably what that part is based on. The best ending of Pikmin 3 states that the crash landings might not be an accident, so give him some slack on that front. The ship itself is the Hokotate Freight steamship, which is the one you have in Pikmin 2, and is owned by the company Olimar works for, as in the first game it was Olimar's very own SS Dolphin. In the third game, the ship is the SS Drake, which is the ship Alpha and his team use and not Olimar, so it would have been cool if when using the Alpha alt, this is the ship you fly away in during the final smash, but then again that ship already shows up in the background of the Garden of Hope stage. Anyways, Lucario is the only character in Smash to have had their final smash changed in Smash 4 from Brawl, but then went back to their Brawl final smash in Ultimate. I guess you could say Charizard also has this quality, but they were only a solo character in Smash 4, so personally I wouldn't count it. Anyways, in Brawl and Ultimate, Lucario's final smash was Aura Storm, which surprisingly isn't a move at all in Pokemon. You know Aura, the blue stuff that Lucario attacks with in Smash? Yeah, they just shoot a big beam of that stuff in their final smash. So it's not based on an actual attack from the Pokemon series, but more just so on the fact that Lucario fights with Aura. There's a small difference in his final smash in Ultimate compared to Brawl, and that's that he turns into Mega Lucario during it. It's only a visual difference, but at least it's something. Now in Smash 4, their final smash was Mega Lucario, just a transformation final smash where they get ultra powerful for a bit, because in Smash their main mechanic is getting stronger. Contrary to very popular belief, this final smash doesn't put them at the max aura level, instead it just makes all their attacks do 1.8 times their normal damage. In Smash 4, when Lucario is at max aura, which is at 190%, their attacks will do 1.7 times their normal damage, so their final smash just makes them a tiny bit stronger than max aura. Anyways, this final smash is just simply based on Lucario's Mega Evolution in Pokemon. It makes perfect sense for this to be the final smash, since Mega Lucario is pretty much the face of Mega Evolution as a whole, since in Pokemon X and Y, the game Mega Evolution debuted in, your first time seeing Mega Evolution is in a fight against a Mega Lucario, in which you're forced to also use a Mega Lucario. I don't really have much more to say about this final smash, which is why I primarily focused on the fun fact about the stats misconception in Smash 4. Okay, so now it's time to talk about R.O.B's final smash origins, right? Well yeah, but he's a bit of a weird case. He's the fourth and last character to have had the final smash change in every game since Brawl. And yeah, while he does indeed have 3 different final smashes, they aren't really based on anything at all. I hope you could hear the asterisk behind that sentence because, well, let me explain. R.O.B as a character is completely made up. He's the only fighter in Smash to not be from a video game. He's a toy. He's obviously related to video games, but he's not from a video game. I mean, he was in Mario Kart DS, but you know what I mean. This means that pretty much every move he has is completely made up. He has his gyro from his toy set, but that's pretty much it. The way you play with R.O.B is that you point him at your TV, and his eyes detect color changes in the 2 games he was compatible with, and then performs certain actions in the real world on a real controller. It's very likely that the lasers he shoots from his eyes in all 3 of his final smashes are based on this optoelectronics technology, but that's all speculation. Anyways, as for what the final smashes do, in Brawl it was the fusion beam, and it gave him a small area in front of him where he's constantly shooting a ton of weak lasers, and it's pretty much just a reskin of the super spicy curry item, except a lot worse. In Smash 4 it was Super Diffusion Beam, in which he's stationary and just shoots some big weird looking laser that splits into 4, followed by 1 big laser at the end. And finally in Ultimate it's Guided Robo Beam, which follows the same idea as the Smash 4 Final Smash, except it starts with a bunch of small, weak targeted lasers, followed by a big laser, and then finishing it off with a very brief and even bigger laser. Well, that was somewhat interesting, and now to switch over to something that isn't interesting at all. Toon Link's Final Smash. By now in the video you should know that I have a strong hatred for Triforce Slash, which was Link's Final Smash in Brawl and Smash 4, and Young Link's Final Smash in Ultimate. And since I'm talking about it again, can you guess what Toon Link's Final Smash is? That's right, It's the stupid Triforce Slash again. Yes, for 3 games in a row now, Toon Link has had the same uninspired, no origin having Final Smash that's extremely inaccurate to the Zelda series, completely made up, and 100% stupid. I'm not gonna go into too much depth here since this is the 3rd time this video I'm talking about this move, and I've made it abundantly clear by now that it's completely made up. I do want to mention that I have a personal little theory that this Final Smash only exists because it's a very flashy looking move, which would have been perfect material to show off in Brawl's original reveal trailer. And then they just decided to also give it to Toon Link in Brawl, because he's a clone of Link. Then didn't decide to change either of them in Smash 4, and then when they finally changed Link's Final Smash in Ultimate, they didn't care enough about Toon Link to change his, and they couldn't think of anything better for young Link, or they got lazy and just gave him something that already exists. It really should have been Hurricane Spin, but I digress. Let's just move on forever from this lame Final Smash. Now Wolf's Brawl Final Smash was Landmaster. Yet another copy-pasted Final Smash. Yes, he has the same Final Smash in Brawl as both Fox and Falco, so I'll keep this short. The Landmaster comes from Star Fox 64, where it's a tank that can fly for a short bit, used by Fox in a few of the land-based stages. Wolf is in that game, but his team literally never use a Landmaster, or are even known to have them, so this Final Smash doesn't make much sense. At all. However, it's very well known that in Brawl, Wolf was extremely rushed and put in the game at the very last second, so it makes perfect sense that his Final Smash would also have to be heavily recycled. A quick fun detail though, is that the trophy description of this Final Smash states that Wolf analyzed Fox's Landmaster and basically stole the idea, which I think is a pretty cute touch, and a nice way to somewhat justify this blatant copy-pasting. At least they made the unique model though. And also, his Final Smash is actually a bit stronger than both Fox and Falco's Landmaster, but in turn it lasts a little less long, so I guess it's not a complete copy and paste job. And finally, when he made his triumphant return in Ultimate, his new Final Smash is... I can't do this anymore. It's Team Starwolf. Basically, the same thing as Fox and Falco's Ultimate Final Smash. In case you didn't know, Wolf is a bad guy in Star Fox, and he has his own team, much like Fox, called Starwolf, which consists of Wolf O'Donnell, Leon Pawalski, Andrew Oikeny, and Pigma Dengar, and much like Star Fox, they also fly in R-Wing-like ships called the Wolfen. This Final Smash is just Wolf commanding his gang to fire at will, pretty much exactly like what Fox does in his Final Smash. I guess Wolf analyzed that one to rip off as well. And now we're finally at the Smash 4 characters, starting of course with Villager, the very first Smash 4 character announced. His Final Smash is Dream Home, where he pays Tom, Timmy, and Tommy Nook a bunch of bells to build a house on you, which then explodes, for some reason. Every mainline Animal Crossing entry is a life simulation game, and your house has always been a big part of it. Tom Nook, a very important character in most of these games, sells you a house that you can freely decorate from the inside. Starting with Animal Crossing New Leaf, which was the newest entry when Smash 4 came out, you were able to choose exactly where you want your house to be by leading Tom Nook to a spot where he will then set up construction, and this is pretty much what happens in his Final Smash 2, except a lot quicker. Tom Nook tosses in a bunch of furniture as well, so we can assume by the name of the attack that this house is fully decorated inside, which isn't really what he does in Animal Crossing. At most he'll give you a bed and a lamp or something. But I guess fully decorating your house is like the main goal of Animal Crossing, so to say, so I guess it makes sense for this to be his Final Smash. Mega Man's Final Smash is Mega Legends, which is him shooting a small black hole, and if you hit someone with it, a bunch of different Mega Man-like characters shows up to shoot a big beam in tandem with you at the enemy. While this attack is completely made up, the black hole he shoots at the start of it is the black hole bomb weapon you get in Mega Man 9 after defeating Galaxy Man, which lets you shoot small black holes, as expected. The other Mega Man-like characters I mentioned earlier are actually all just Mega Man from different games. The Mega Man franchise has had a lot of spin-off entries over the years, and those other Mega Men are all just what he looked like in those games, although they are actually different characters. Namely, they are X from Mega Man X, Mega Man.exe from Mega Man Battle Network, Mega Man Full Nut from Mega Man Legends, and Star Force Mega Man from Mega Man Star Force. In Ultimate, he has the exact same Final Smash, except 2 more characters were added to the cinematic. They aren't Mega Men like the others, but they are important characters to the series, namely Proto Man from Mega Man 3 and Bass from Mega Man 7. And lastly, the different lasers they all shoot in tandem is a completely made up attack. It looks sick though. And yes, during this whole segment I said Mega Man 15 times. Wii Fit Trainer's Final Smash is completely made up. Who would have guessed? Wii Fit is a yoga fitness game, so obviously there's no actual fighting in it at all. You do a lot of yoga poses in Wii Fit, of course, and the symbols she shoots during this attack are all just different yoga poses. I don't really have much more to say about this Final Smash. I also don't think they could have done much else for her, although I have always thought it would have been really funny if she had a cutscene Final Smash where she puts whoever she hit with the initial hit through an extremely rough yoga session, which ends with them collapsing and then getting launched, kinda like her Smash 4 announcement trailer. That would have been amazing. Rosalina and Luma's Final Smash is Power Star, in which she summons a big Power Star above her head, which then shoots a bunch of smaller stars all around it until it explodes. It's not very good. Power Stars are the main collectible in Super Mario 64, Galaxy, the game Rosalina is from, and Galaxy 2. In Ultimate, she got a quote-unquote new Final Smash. It's literally the same thing except she summons a Grand Star now, and the attack has also been renamed the Grand Star. These things are just from Mario Galaxy 1 and 2, and unlike the normal Power Stars, Grand Stars are only collected after a boss stage, and in both games they allow you to go to new areas. You probably guessed this already, but Rosalina never does this in either of the games. Instead, she's the caretaker of the Comet Observatory in Mario Galaxy 1 specifically, which is where all Power Stars and Grand Stars are held. Little Mac's Final Smash in Smash 4 was Gigamac, where he transforms into this hugely berserk alter ego of his, and you can freely control him for a while. In Ultimate, his new Final Smash is Gigamac Rush, where he still transforms into Gigamac, but instead of being able to control him freely, he does a big flurry of attacks and then ends it with one big final uppercut. Pretty much exactly like how Donkey Kong's Final Smash works. Which is pretty funny considering they fought each other before Smash already. Maybe they're friends now and have taught each other this move. But either way, both of Little Mac's Final Smashes are obviously based on the same thing. That being the Little Mac transformation from Punch-Out for the Wii. In the multiplayer mode of that game, both players control Little Mac, but one at a time can transform into Gigamac after landing enough specific punches, which just like in Smash, is just a bigger and stronger version of Little Mac. Our favorite Water Ninja Frog Pokemon's Final Smash is Secret Ninja Attack, where he launches you in the air and then performs a secret ninja attack of sorts, which is just him teleporting around you a bunch while consistently striking at you before smashing you back down to the ground. With a name this generic, it's obviously not based on a move from Pokemon. However, the mat Greninja uses to launch you in the air at the start is a tatami mat, which is one of those mats you often see in Japanese-styled rooms like these. This actually is based on a Pokemon move, namely Mat Block, also known as Tatami Flip in Japan. Greninja was the only Pokemon able to learn this move in Generation 6, making it one of their signature moves, until this thing was also able to learn it in Generation 7. The attack that follows is completely made up. Some people seem to think that this is based on the Pokemon move Night Slash with the moon in the background and all. I can definitely see where people are coming from when they say this, but the original name for Night Slash in Japanese is Crossroad Killing, and it has nothing to do with the night at all, so it's likely just a big coincidence. Instead, the moon showing up is probably just based on the idea that ninjas hide under the darkness of the night, since, you know, Greninja is a ninja. In Ultimate, this Final Smash was kept the exact same except that Greninja now transforms into Ash Greninja during it. This is a special form of Greninja that doesn't actually come from one of the games, but rather the Pokemon anime. In said anime, Ash, who I'm sure you know who that is, had a Greninja, and through the power of friendship, yes really, he was able to turn into Ash Greninja, which is basically just a super powerful form of Greninja that has some kind of special bond with Ash, which also makes them feel each other's pain. Ash Greninja would later appear in the games, since the special demo for Pokemon Sun and Moon gave you a Greninja with the ability Battle Bond, which allows it to transform into Ash Greninja, and you were also able to transfer this special Greninja to the full version of the game later when it came out. Quick fun fact before we move on, Greninjas with the ability Battle Bond are always male and cannot be female, meaning that even though Greninja is a Pokemon without a visual gender difference, we know that the Greninja in Smash specifically is male because he can transform into Ash Greninja. I just thought this was an interesting way to find out, so I wanted to share this piece of useless information. It is in my blood after all to do so. As I'm sure we all know, the Mii Fighters have completely made up movesets, and this is also true for their Final Smashes, so there are no origins for them. At all. Which means I really can't say much about them. They're all just based on the idea of each fighter. Mii Brawler's Omega Blitz is just a bunch of fast punches and kicks. Mii Sword Fighter's Final Edge is just them holding up their sword to shoot out a bunch of air slices out of it. One thing I really want to mention though is that this was the only Final Smash, and by extension the only move in general in all of Smash 4 that differed between the two versions of the game. In Smash 4 3DS, the air slices they shoot out of their sword are big and travel back to back in a pretty straight line, while in Smash 4 Wii U, the air slices are instead smaller and disperse over a wider area, giving it more effective range but less accuracy and damage potential overall. I don't know why this move out of everything in Smash 4 they decided to differ in both versions, but it's pretty cool regardless. Anyways, in Ultimate, Final Edge was changed to instead have them continuously swing their sword at high speed to shoot at the air slices instead of just holding it up, which makes a bit more sense, and the attack functions more like it did in Smash 4 Wii U. And Mii Gunner's Full Blast is just them shooting their arm cannon at, well, full blast. Interestingly enough, during this Final Smash, two small flying drone-like things show up behind you to also shoot out two big lasers. Some people told me this is actually based on the Mii Plaza game Mii Force on 3DS, since in that game, which is a 2D shooter, you can get upgrades that shoot lasers, and that's the whole connection. Personally, I don't agree. Saying that these drones that shoot lasers come from this space shooter where you have some laser attacks is really vague and not very convincing at all. The Mii Fighters in Smash don't have any references in their movesets to Mii games, or any games that features the Mii avatars, which makes sense since they're considered Smash original characters, not Mii Plaza characters or anything like that. It was still worth pointing out though. And since we're on the topic of lasers anyways, let's get into Palutena's Final Smash, which is Black Hole Laser, where she first traps you in a small black hole, and then shoots a giant laser at you while you're trapped. In Kid Icarus Uprising, you could equip yourself with consumable abilities, simply called powers, and if you remember from Smash 4, Palutena's main gimmick was that all her custom special moves were different powers from Kid Icarus Uprising, such as Heavenly Light and Angelic Missile. Her Final Smash was no different, since the two moves she uses in it are also two powers from said game, namely Black Hole and Mega Laser. Black Hole plus Mega Laser was actually a really powerful combo in the game's competitive multiplayer mode, and it is completely possible that the Smash team was aware of this during Smash 4's development, and made this Palutena's Final Smash for that reason. Especially likely considering both games are directed by Masahiro Sakurai, and also the Black Hole power specifically was exclusive to said multiplayer mode. Pac-Man's Final Smash is Super Pac-Man, where he turns into the classic Pac-Man form and grows really large for a moment. In Smash 4, you were able to freely move him around while chasing down opponents, and if you touch someone, a score display shows up and they turn into two pixelated eyes for a short moment, just like what happens when you eat a ghost in the original Pac-Man. In Ultimate, this Final Smash was changed in that instead of being able to move him around freely, he zips around across the screen a few times at increasingly faster speeds, and you're only able to slightly nudge his angle a little bit every time he reappears, making this Final Smash, of course, infinitely less fun. Anyways, this attack is very obviously based on the game Super Pac-Man from 1982. The attack even has the same name as that game. In said game, you were able to eat big green pellets that make you grow really big and also make you go really fast if you hold down a button. Right before he transforms, you can even see him eat one of these green pellets alongside a regular pellet to make sure he can eat his enemies. And just like in Super Pac-Man, you can hold down the special button to go a little faster. The new flashy look the move has in Ultimate has been theorized to be based on Pac-Man Championship Edition, because I don't know if you've seen footage of that game, but it is a very flashy looking game. Robin's Final Smash is Pair Up, where he summons Chrom to deliver a bunch of attacks together with him, before both of them slamming the captured opponent back into the ground. This Final Smash is based on the Pair Up mechanic from Robin's origin game, Fire Emblem Awakening, in which two individual units pair up to essentially become one very powerful unit. Robin invented this tactic in the game's story, and Chrom and Robin are essentially the two main characters of the game, so it makes sense for Robin to specifically pair up with Chrom during this Final Smash. The Chrom cut-in you see before they attack in Smash is directly based on the same cut-in that shows up before Chrom gets a critical hit in this game. Robin ends this string of attacks with Bolganon, which is just simply one of the most powerful fire-based spells in the series and holds no real special significance with the character or anything. In Ultimate, his new Final Smash is... oh. He didn't get a new Final Smash, even though Chrom is a playable character now. That is so lazy and stupid. Why didn't they change his Final Smash in Ultimate to have Robin pair up with a different character from Awakening or something? I mean, if you use this Final Smash against Chrom, nothing changes and Chrom just attacks a clone of himself. There isn't even a special voice line for it or anything, almost like it's an oversight. Shulk's final smash is Chain Attack, where he calls two of his friends, Ricky and Dunban, to attack the opponent with a bunch of attacks alongside him. Dunban then knocks the opponent upwards, where Shulk finishes them off with a big swing of the Monado to send them flying. In Xenoblade Chronicles, you have a bar in the top left of the screen called the party gauge that you fill up through various means, and when it's completely full, you can perform a chain attack, where you and your two party members take turns attacking the enemy, allowing for many different strategies. I don't think most of the attacks we see the characters do in Smash are actually based on specific moves they have in Xenoblade, although we do see Ricky clearly perform Luigi, where he spits out some purple poison cloud. Dunban and Shulk seem to just do random swings with their swords. And now I'm gonna talk about the upsetting way they changed this final smash in Ultimate. It's a huge spoiler, and I'd hate to spoil my favorite game if you haven't played it. So if you don't want to hear about it, go to the timestamp shown on screen to just skip ahead to the next character. There's your warning, 3, 2, 1. So in Ultimate, they added a fourth party member to the chain attack, namely Fiora in her Mechon form. I don't like this change, since if they're gonna go out of their way to add a fourth party member, which makes it inaccurate since chain attacks can only be done with 3 characters in Xenoblade, then why not go the extra mile and add the remaining 3 party members as well, instead of just the one that's a huge spoiler, you know? Well anyways, me being a huge dumb nerd aside, let's just move on to Bowser Jr.'s final smash, which is Shadow Mario Paint, where he turns into Shadow Mario and draws a giant X on the screen, which damages the opponents somehow, and then explodes while launching everyone caught in it. In Super Mario Sunshine, Bowser Jr.'s debut game, he disguises himself as Shadow Mario and pollutes Isle Delfino with his magic paintbrush to try and frame the real Mario for doing it, Among Us style. I'm sorry. The paint scene in Smash is orange and damages the opponents, which leads me personally to believe it is specifically based on the fire paint scene in one of the episodes of the Pianta Village stage, which is similarly orange and hurts a lot more than all other types of paint. Bowser Jr. has also left behind some graffiti on some areas in the shape of an X, which drops blue coins, so that may be why he draws an X in Smash. If you use an alt for Bowser Jr.'s, which are the Koopalings, they still transform into Shadow Mario, which doesn't really make a lot of sense since they aren't even in Mario Sunshine at all, but I guess it's fair to expect them to not make new Final Smashes based on alts. Also, as a quick side note, I personally believe this Final Smash, specifically its appearance in Ultimate, to be the worst Final Smash ever created in any of the Smash games. I mean, when recording footage of every Final Smash in each of the games, this was the only one I had to do twice because I barely did any damage the first time. And even then, the second time, when I was actively trying to get the opponent damaged by it, wasn't much better, as I only managed to do 14% to a CPU standing still. It's a little better in a big frantic free-for-all against CPUs that don't know how to just don't touch the lines, but in a 1v1 against real people, it's gotta be the worst. Anyways, quick tangent aside, Duck Hunt Duo's final smash is NES Sapper Posse, where they summon a bunch of ducks that then transport the opponent hit by them into a field with a bunch of gunmen, who then all shoot at them until they get launched. This final smash is pretty interesting. While it has no direct origin, it does reference 3 NES games. The ducks are obviously from Duck Hunt, gunmen that are firing at you are from Wild Gunman, and the cardboard cutouts said gunmen are shooting at are from Hogan's Alley. A lot of Duck Hunt Duo's moveset is just references to NES games that use the light gun accessory, and they made their final smash just a big homage to those type of games, which I thought was pretty interesting, especially since it involves firing from guns, just like what you do with the Zapper. The dog even takes on their 8-bit appearance from Duck Hunt. However, the can, which also comes from Hogan Alley, sadly isn't 8-bit. And now it's time for Mr. Fighting Game himself, Ryu, from Streets. And even though he's a Smash 4 character that didn't get his final smash changed in Ultimate, he still has 2 final smashes to go over. Yeah, he's actually the first and one of only 3 characters to have 2 final smashes, which in Ryu's case depends on how far away you are from the opponent when you press the special button if you have a final smash ready. Let's start with Shin Shoryuken, the final smash you get if you use it when standing right next to your enemy. You know his up special, Shoryuken? Shin Shoryuken functions as basically a super powerful form of that move. It's even an uppercut attack and all. Shin Shoryuken originates from Street Fighter 3 New Generations, where it was one of Ryu's super arts, and it's pretty much the same thing you see as in Smash. The big uppercut where he pauses twice before flying upwards. Something that's interesting about this final smash is that if the final hit is going to KO or is likely to result in a KO, the background turns orange for a moment, which is a reference to how the same thing would happen in Street Fighter 4 if you land the finishing blow of a fight with a super or ultra combo. The reason I find this so interesting is because this was also the case in Smash 4, and something similar to this later became a main mechanic in Smash Ultimate, if you deal an attack strong enough to KO on the final stock of a stock match. I wouldn't be surprised if this mechanic in Ultimate was inspired by this mechanic in Smash 4 with Ryu's Final Smash, which in turn came from the same mechanic in Street Fighter 4. Another thing I quickly want to mention is that in the very specific and hard to get scenario where you miss the move initially but then still manage to hit with it afterwards, it'll instead act as a weird multi-hit, which is also what happens in Street Fighter if you miss the initial hit. It's not nearly as strong like this though. Anyways, his second Final Smash, if you stand far away from the opponent when activating it, is Shinku Hadoken, which is just a very big and powerful version of Hadoken. You know, his neutral special. This move comes from Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, where it was his super combo in that game, and just like in Smash, it's pretty much just a very strong Hadoken blast that hits multiple times. It didn't actually look like a bigger version of Hadoken until later games in the series, such as Street Fighter 3. I don't actually have a lot more to say about this one, so instead let's just move on. Ryu's Echo Fighter, Ken Masters, also has 2 Final Smashes, based on how close he is to his opponent when using it, just like with Ryu. Let's start with the up close one, which is Shippu Jinrai Hyaku, where he performs a bunch of fast kicks, eventually kicking in circles so fast he takes you airborne, where he eventually launches you with a final powerful kick. Just like with Ryu's up close Final Smash, this move also originates from one of the Street Fighter 3 games, in which it was also one of his super arts. Now, I can't talk about this move without mentioning the most famous moment in all of competitive video game history, Evo Moment 37 from Evo 2004, where legendary Street Fighter player Daigo Umehara, playing against Justin Wong's Chun-Li, got 15 almost frame-perfect parries in a row to block her super, while on literally 1 health, used this move afterwards to finish Justin off and win the game. This moment ended up being so legendary that it was even referenced in Ken's reveal trailer, where he parried Little Mac's attack and then did his Final Smash. The pose Ken does when initiating the Final Smash is the exact same as his parry pose, meaning that it looks almost seamless if you do it directly after a parry. In his reveal trailer, they specifically cut the footage up in a way that makes it look like he does it directly out of a parry, so at least there I know that it's 100% a reference to Evo Moment 37. Look, I can even cut my own footage up to make it look like it works out of a parry. Would be cool if it actually worked like that in game though. Anyways, moving on from that, his far away Final Smash is the infinitely less cool Shin Ryuken, where he does an uppercut which pulls enemies close and creates a big pillar of fire. Basically, it is again a very strong version of his up special, Shoryuken. In name and function, this move comes from the first Street Fighter Alpha game, where it was one of Ken's super combos, but you might have noticed already that there's no flame pillar around it. That wouldn't appear until X-Man vs Street Fighter in 1996. Masahiro Sakurai even said that they made it look flashy like it is in the Versus series, in the Nintendo Direct where Ken was revealed.
First, the spinning uppercut, Shin Ryuken. We've made it look flashy, as it is in the Versus series.
And this flame pillar being added is probably what he meant. Also, I didn't know this until I started doing research for this video, but apparently this Final Smash does more damage if you mash buttons during it, like it does in the Versus series, which honestly blew my mind. Cloud's Final Smash is Omni Slash, where he dashes towards the enemy, and if it hits, he launches them in the air to perform a bunch of sword slashes against them before crashing back down with them. In the original Final Fantasy VII, this was Cloud's final limit break move, which could be learned by winning an item of the same name in the Battle Square minigame in the Gold Saucer area, and having all other limit breaks already learned. Final boss / ending spoilers for Final Fantasy VII ahead. It's a really old game, but I'm still gonna give a warning since it might be the same in the upcoming remake, so you've been warned. 3, 2, 1. After the final Sephiroth fight, Cloud gets transported into his mind or something. FF7 lore is very confusing, to have one last standoff with Sephiroth. You only need to hit him once to win this fight, and regardless of if you learned Omni Slash through the Gold Saucer or not, Cloud will have access to this move in this fight, to bring this game to an incredibly flashy end. Speaking of Sephiroth, I'm sure you're aware that he later became a DLC character in Smash Ultimate, and when he did, Cloud was actually given a second Final Smash in the form of Omni Slash version 5. Cloud's alternate costume comes from the movie Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, and if you use this costume, he instead uses the second Final Smash as of version 10.1.0, which is the version that unofficially added Sephiroth through the Sephiroth challenge. In these alts, his Buster Sword is replaced with the Fusion Sword, and he splits it into 6 different blades during this Final Smash, to strike his opponent with differing blades each swing, until he again comes crashing back down with them. And yes, as you might have guessed, this Final Smash is directly based on a scene from Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, where he uses this move in one of the many fights he has in said movie against Sephiroth. This scene takes a while, so I'm just gonna let it finish playing here. without audio, and this chocobo covering a bit of the screen so that I'm a lot less likely to get a copyright claim for using this footage in my video. Alright, nice job, Cloud. I'm sure that'll be the last you'll ever see of Sephiroth. Alright, that was the last character to have 2 Final Smashes. Everyone else from here on out either didn't get a new one in Ultimate, or is a newcomer in Ultimate, meaning that they can't have gotten a new Final Smash. So with that out of the way, let's continue on to Corrin. Yeah, you didn't forget about him, did you? Corrin's Final Smash is Torrential Roar, where he turns into his dragon form, stomps the ground, and shouts out a giant water torrent, washing his opponents up and away until they get launched. Now this is not gonna take long at all. Corrin is a silent dragon, which is why he can transform into this ugly dragon form. And silent dragons have some water magic abilities, which is why he shoots out a giant torrent in the cutscene here. Yeah, that's it. Bayonetta's Final Smash is Infernal Climax, where she slows down time, similar to her Witch Time ability, and if you fill the meter at the bottom of the screen during this by hitting enough attacks, she will summon the demon known as Gamora, Devourer of the Divine, to chomp down on her enemies. In the Bayonetta series, she can often use incredibly gruesome finishing moves that involve her summoning demons using her hair that come and beat the ever-living crap out of her enemies. In her Final Smash, she specifically summons Gamora, like I said, which is usually the first demon summon you get to do in her games, and during these summons, you often have to mash a button or something as a quick time event to maximize power, which is also what you can do in Smash. The cutscene in Smash actually looks pretty much identical to this one from Bayonetta 2, albeit a lot shorter. The camera angles and stuff like that are pretty much the same. And one other thing you might have noticed is that this Final Smash is censored. Well, aside from the blood obviously, Bayonetta usually gets completely naked during these summons, since she uses her hair to do so, and her outfit is made of her hair. This obviously doesn't happen in Smash. Instead, she only loses a little bit of her outfit, much like during her Smash attacks, which also use this hair demon summoning ability. Yeah, that's a fun picture to look at if you didn't know her outfit was her hair. You're welcome. And with Bayonetta finished, we're finally at the Ultimate characters. This is where Final Smashes get really creative in my opinion, so I hope you're excited for them, even though almost all of them have a cutscene Final Smash. Starting of course with Inkling, her Final Smash is Killer Whale, where she puts down a Killer Whale, which shoots out a big beam of sound waves and ink, in the same color as whichever alt you're using, to damage the enemy and also leave them fully inked afterwards. Even though Splatoon 2 was already long out at the time of Smash Ultimate's release and Inkling's reveal, they are pretty much 100% based on the first Splatoon game. Both Splatoon 1 and 2 have completely different special attacks, and the Killer Whale is obviously a special attack from Splatoon 1. These are moves that you can charge up by shooting the ground with enough ink to fill up a meter. The Killer Whale special is pretty much what you see in Smash, although you can't aim it around after you've placed it down. You can freely choose where to aim it before actually firing it though. Music plays a big role in the Splatoon universe, and this special is shooting out a sound blast through a huge music speaker, so I think this is a very good idea for Inkling's Final Smash. I really couldn't imagine it being something else honestly. Ridley's Final Smash is Plasma Scream, where he dashes forwards and if it hits someone, it launches them against Samus's gunship, which is just casually chilling in space, until Ridley blows it up with a big laser blast from his mouth. This specific scenario is made up for Smash, but Samus's gunship has been heavily damaged before, such as in the opening of Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, which is also what her gunship design in this Final Smash is based on. Regular Ridley has never been able to shoot laser beams from his mouth, but he shot a laser that looks pretty much identical to the one seen in his Final Smash in his boss fight from Metroid Prime, where he was Meta Ridley. So if you want to be corny about it, this Final Smash is technically more accurate if you use the Meta Ridley alternate costume. Another really cool detail about this Final Smash is that after it's finished, you can see Samus's ship crashing in the background, because, you know, it's been shot by a big laser. I do wonder who's piloting the ship though, considering you can use this attack against Samus. Maybe it was just taking itself for a spacewalk or something. Simon and Richter both have the same Final Smash, so we're gonna cross them both out at the same time, namely being Grand Cross. See what I did there? In this Final Smash, they seal their opponents in a coffin, launch them in the air with their whip, and makes a bunch of crosses appear to attack it. Okay. Grand Cross is an attack that has appeared in the Castlevania series from time to time, and it made its debut in Rondo of Blood, which is the game Richter was originally from, and he's often the person associated with the technique. In that game it was an item crash, basically just an attack you could do that made crosses appear from the bottom of the screen to attack enemies, pretty much what you see in Smash Bros as well. Simon has never been able to use this exact move, but he was able to use a variant of it in the fighting game spin-off Castlevania Judgment. The only real footage I could find of this was this low quality GIF from the Castlevania wiki. That's Simon right there using a variant of Grand Cross. Finding info about this game online is surprisingly difficult, which may be because this game was apparently really bad. But I was told that Simon can indeed use a Grand Cross variant in this game. Point is, this is a somewhat common ability in the Castlevania series, though Simon hasn't been able to use it exactly. So if you want to be fancy, you could pretend this is actually Richter's Final Smash, which was then also given to Simon. Maybe that's what they did in development. Who knows? Moving on to King K. Rool, his final smash is the incredible Blast-O-Matic, where if the initial hit lands, he sits down on a chair, laughs maniacally, and shoots a giant laser at an island shaped like Donkey Kong's head to blow it up. Okay, dude. In Donkey Kong 64, in which K. Rool is the main antagonist, Donkey Kong and his friends live on Donkey Kong Island, shaped like his head, and K. Rool suddenly drives an island shaped somewhat like him up to DK Isle, and just kinda sits there with it. What he's actually doing is preparing to shoot it with a laser, which you almost get to see in the game's game over screen, and this whole cutscene is what the final smash is based on. We see him laugh while sitting on a throne of some kind, and then point the laser straight at DK Isle. It fades to black before you actually see him shoot it, but I'm sure you can imagine what happens next. You actually do see whoever you hit with the final smash briefly stand atop Donkey Kong Island before he shoots it down, so I guess the initial hit somehow launched you all the way over there. This is one of my personal favorite final smashes in the game, because the idea for it is perfect. He's the main villain in the older Donkey Kong games, and his ultimate attack in Smash is based on one of the DK games' game over screens. That's just such a good idea if you ask me. And also, like I said, you never actually get to see him shoot it, even though that's his grand plan in this game. So being able to finally see it in this final smash is really cool. And now we go from an amazing final smash to a bad one, in my opinion. Isabelle's final smash is Dream Town Hall. Functionally, it is completely identical to Villager's final smash, Dream Home, except it does a tiny bit more damage. Instead of building a house, Tom, Timmy, and Tommy Nook build a town hall instead. In Animal Crossing New Leaf, which is the game Isabelle is from, she can be found chilling in the town hall building. And that's it. That's the origin. Isabelle can be found in the building she attacks you with in the final smash. I'm not a fan of this final smash because it's just lazy and doesn't make sense. You don't build Town Hall in any Animal Crossing game. You also don't get to decorate it, and none of the items you see the Nooks throw into it can be found in it. This is where you go to in Animal Crossing New Leaf if you want to start work on a public works project, which are basically structures in your town that you fund and then takes a day to get built afterwards. You talk to Isabelle for this, and she's in charge of the whole project, so why not have her final smash revolve around them? Oh right, it's because she's basically a villager Echo Fighter, except with a few different moves, and they didn't feel like making a unique final smash for her. Alright, let's move on to a brighter note, literally. Incineroar's final smash is Max Malicious Moonsault, where they throw you against some ropes in a boxing ring, uppercuts you in the air on the bounce back, and performs a small aerial combo on you before headbutting you down to the ground in a huge fiery explosion. This one has a rather simple origin, but they still did something interesting with it. In the 7th generation of Pokemon, Sun and Moon, the games Incineroar is from, they introduced Z moves, basically very powerful attacks that you can use once per battle and require your Pokemon to hold a special stone item, and there's one for each type of Pokemon. So there's a stone for fire, water, grass, ice, ghost, dragon, you name it. On top of that, some Pokemon had unique Z moves that only they could use, and Incineroar, being one of the 3 starters of that game, naturally had one of these unique ones as well. If you give an Incineroar the Insinium Z Stone and they know their signature move, Darkest Lariat, they were able to perform Malicious Moonsault, where they spawn a boxing ring under you, jump from atop the ropes, and crashes onto you in a big fiery explosion. Yeah, he doesn't throw you against the ropes or does the aerial combo or the headbutt spike in the air like in the final smash. You may have also noticed that it has a slightly different name in Pokemon, missing the Max in front of it. That's because the final smash is basically just a souped up version of Incineroar's signature Z move, which I find to be a pretty nice and creative touch, instead of just making it straight up the same move. Also, right before Incineroar performs the final smash, you can briefly see the icon for the Insinium Z Stone flash on their belt, in case you were wondering what that was. Pretty cool final smash all things considered, and I like that they took an idea and just kinda went a little bit further with it. Our first and greatest DLC character, Piranha Plant, is the last character to have a final smash that doesn't feature the game cutting to a cutscene in any way. Yeah, they gave almost every DLC character a final smash that's just a hitbox followed by a cutscene, which is kinda lame in my opinion, but whatever. Piranha Plant's final smash is PD Piranha, where it summons the ruler of all Piranha Plants, PD Piranha, to jump out with some cages in his hands to try and capture some opponents, who he then spits fire on, slam onto the ground, and then he flies away. PD Piranha's first appearance is in Super Mario Sunshine, in which he is the main boss of the Bianco Hills area where you fight him twice, and since then he's appeared in a lot of Mario's spin-off games. Actually, he's pretty much exclusively used in spin-offs. The only two mainline Super Mario games he appears in are Super Mario Sunshine and New Super Mario Bros., in which he is also a boss fight. He spits fire in Smash Ultimate, which is weird because he's never done so in any Mario game. In fact, he's often weak to fire since, you know, he's a plant. So that's PD Piranha's origin, which is all well and good, but obviously I have to mention that the way this Final Smash works is a really hard callback to his boss fight in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. He is the first boss fight in the game's story mode, the Subspace Emissary. This is also where the two cages come from, and here it's also his primary form of attacking. He captures Peach and Zelda in the two cages, so that's where the idea of him capturing fighters in them came from, since he also does that in this Final Smash. I love it when Smash Bros. References its own history like this, so this Final Smash gets a big plus from me. So like I said, almost every remaining Final Smash is a cutscene Final Smash, which doesn't mean they're bad. A shining example is Joker's Final Smash All Out Attack. He dashes forwards, and when he hits someone, everything on screen turns red except the fighters. Then Joker and a bunch of other people jump up and quickly strike the opponent in tandem, until Joker appears in front of the camera and strikes a pose with everyone he hit behind him in the background. This is without a doubt the Final Smash with the single most direct origin of them all. By that I mean that it looks almost completely identical to the thing it is based on. In Persona 5, once you've knocked down every enemy in a fight through any means possible, you can choose to perform an all-out attack with your party, which is basically literally what you see in Smash Bros. Like, actually the same thing. The only real difference here is that the enemies in the background spew high-pressured blood out of them. This was changed to sparkles in Smash Bros., obviously to avoid age rating issues. What's cool in Persona 5 is that the 4 characters you see in this shot change depending on who's currently in your party, and whoever initiated the all-out attack is who you see in the splash screen at the end, and every character has their own one, which is cool. In Smash, there's 2 different versions of the animation, one with Joker, Ryuji, Ann, and Morgana, and another with Joker, Yusuke, Makoto, and Haru. The splash screen at the end is always Joker's though, which is a little bit of a shame, but then again, I guess he was the one to initiate the all-out attack in Smash. Furthermore, whenever you use it, you get a quick comment from either Morgana or Futaba. These are the 2 main Navigator party members in Persona 5, which means they basically commentate each battle. Morgana is also an actual party member that can fight, whereas Futaba is solely a Navigator, which is why she's never in the actual all-out attack animation. And lastly, you probably already know this, but there's an Easter egg in Smash where if you finish a fight with Joker's Final Smash, the battle just ends there and the results of the game are shown over that ending splash screen. This is also straight out of Persona 5. In that game, if you finish a fight with an all-out attack, the battle ends there as well, as it shows you the money and EXP and such you got from the fight. So yeah, that's one of the coolest Final Smashes ever, but let's not dwell on it too long and just move on. Hero's Final Smash is Giga Slash, where his sword gets all lightning-y and he slashes upwards with a big swing. If it hits anybody, a cutscene plays out where a bunch of people put their weapons together to seemingly power up Hero's sword for one last big slash. Giga Slash is a reoccurring magic attack that debuted in Dragon Quest VI, where it was just a very powerful late-game magic attack as expected. The Luminary, aka Default Hero, can also learn Giga Slash in his game, Dragon Quest XI, and there the sword he uses looks to be made of blue lightning, just like how it looks in Smash during the cinematic. The bunch of people I mentioned earlier are actually all the prior protagonists of the Dragon Quest games. From left to right, they are from Dragon Quest V, 10, 7, 1, 6, 9, and 2. If you also take into account the 4 playable protagonists, which are from Dragon Quest 3, 4, 8, and 11, they're actually all represented in Smash because of this Final Smash. This whole part with all the other protagonists showing up is completely made up. It's really cool though, so I'm not complaining. One last thing I should mention is that after this Final Smash was created, Square Enix put the attack in some Japanese exclusive Dragon Quest arcade game. It has a way longer animation but still features every main character from Dragon Quest 1 through 11. The main 4 characters that are attacking are even the same ones as the playable alts in Smash, so it's undoubtedly a big reference to Hero's Final Smash, which is really interesting. Anyways, moving on. Banjo and Kazooie's final smash is the mighty Jinjonator, where some kind of statue comes up, then comes alive, then flies into the enemy a bunch until it sends them flying. The origin of this final smash is really simple. There are 5 Jinjos to collect in each level of Banjo-Kazooie, and at the tail end of the final fight against Gruntilda, this huge statue of Jinjo shows up and tells you to activate it. After doing so by shooting a bunch of eggs into its holes, it comes to life, the 4 Jinjos that helped you in the fight fly into it, and then it repeatedly bashes into Gruntilda to destroy her impenetrable shield, and once it's done that, it charges up for one last big bash into her, knocking her off the tower and defeating her for good. Until she comes back in the second game. The Jinjonator in Smash also rams into the opponent a bunch, but much faster, and with the other Jinjos surrounding it, which looks a lot nicer in my opinion. And now on to Terry's final smash, which starts with him creating 3 flame pillars, then using Power Dunk, and then his signature Buster Wolf attack. The first thing he does, Triple Geyser, basically that one special move he has except 3 times in a row, and each time the geyser appears a little further away, originates from the 1995 game Fatal Fury 3, originally for the arcades, where it was one of his desperation moves. The other 2 moves he does in his cinematic are just Power Dunk and Buster Wolf respectively. However, I personally believe this whole string of specials might be based on his King of Fighters 14 appearance, since in that game, his 3 climax specials just happen to be a form of Triple Geyser, a form of Power Dunk, and a form of Buster Wolf. The Power Dunk one, specifically called Start Dunk Volcano, even has pretty much the same camera angle as in Smash. Really cool final smash if you ask me. And now we move on to one of my least favorite final smashes in the game, Progenitor God of Ruptured Heaven, which is the longest name of any final smash in the game with 30 characters including spaces. Technically Ryu and Ken have a longer final smash name with 31 characters, but that's 2 final smashes. Anyways, this is Byleth's final smash, and it has him swing his whip sword and then Sothis appears in the background to tell Byleth they're connected or something, and Byleth then does the same thing again. Just like with Incineroar's final smash, this is an upgraded version of an attack they have in their home game. In Fire Emblem 3 Houses, Byleth can perform the sword combat art Ruptured Heaven if he uses his trademark sword, the Sword of the Creator. This attack does a little bit more damage if used against dragon enemies, and during it, Byleth swings the sword around a bit in whip form, granting the attack more range than sword attacks usually have. Sothis, the character that shows up in the background, is a pretty important character in Fire Emblem 3 Houses. I won't spoil too much, but she is a god that basically lives inside Byleth's head for story reasons, and is tied to the Sword of the Creator, again for story reasons. At some point decently early in the game, something happens between Byleth and Sothis, which causes Byleth's hair to change to a way lighter shade of green. You know those alts that are just Byleth but with this different hair color? Yeah, that's a reference to that. You may have also noticed that even if you pick the regular alt, his hair will always be this shade of green in the cutscene. It doesn't really make sense at all for his hair to change during the attack and then change back afterwards, but I guess it's a nice reference. Now that aside, I don't like this final smash at all, mostly because of how ugly it is. Like, the sprite of Sothis in the background doesn't look good, this shot looks terrible and unfinished, the attack Byleth does is just boring and uninteresting, and finally I hate the character of Sothis. Yes, I've played 3 Houses. Min Min's final smash is Arms Rush, where she gets a whole posse together to beat you up with their extendable arms, and then finally at the end, Min Min shoots you with a huge laser from her dragon arm into a gong. In Arms, the fighting game she's from, there's a mechanic called Rush, where you could build up a meter, and when it's full, you could rush your opponent with a big flurry of punches with your currently equipped arms. This is pretty much just what the final smash is based on, but they spiced it up a bit to include a bunch of other fighters from Arms, namely Springman, Ribbon Girl, Twintel, Mechanica, Master Mummy, and Ninjara. How all their arms don't get tangled up, I have no idea. The gong that appears at the end is based on the one that's featured in Min Min's stage in Arms, Ramen Bowl. It doesn't do anything gameplay wise, so it's just a neat callback to her home stage, which is at the ramen store she owns. One funny thing I quickly wanted to mention is that in the Dutch version of Smash Ultimate, this move is called Armageddon, spelled with arm in all caps. I just thought that was funny. Steve's very creative final smash is House of Boom, where he places down a huge pushing block of some sorts, which then launches you into said House of Boom that's filled with TNT blocks and monsters, and then the whole thing explodes with you inside it. Alright, there's a lot to unpack here, so strap in. First of all, the pushing block he places down is a piston, which has the ability to push blocks when powered by something like a redstone trail, which is basically just electricity in Minecraft. There isn't a big variant or anything like it in Minecraft, so the huge one he places down in Smash is just made for Smash Bros, and the actual House of Boom you get launched into is also made up, though obviously you would be able to recreate it in Minecraft if you really wanted to. I actually found a video online of someone recreating it pretty dang well in Minecraft, so check it out if you're interested. I'll link it in the description of this video. Like I said, this isn't a naturally generating building in Minecraft, though there are plenty of structures in the game that look like it. Personally, I always thought it might have been based on jungle pyramids, which just like House of Boom are filled with traps. The monsters that appear in House of Boom are zombies and the very iconic creepers, which explode, and it's likely what set off all the TNT in the room. And at the end, Steve can be seen eating some food, specifically a steak, as a rude gesture or something. Finally, the explosion texture seen in the cutscene looks like the one from Minecraft Bedrock Edition, suggesting that this was recorded in that version. Minecraft is all about building stuff and using your own creativity, so I love that the Smash team did just that for this Final Smash. Sephiroth's Final Smash is Supernova, where he swings his huge katana once, and if it hits you, he takes on this godly form with a ton of wings, and then makes a meteor destroy a bunch of planets that cause a supernova, that then makes Earth disintegrate. Damn. So now I'm obviously gonna talk about this Final Smash's origins, but it spoils something big that's really cool about Final Fantasy VII, so I'm gonna give a spoiler warning first. This spoils the ending segment of Final Fantasy VII just like with Cloud's Final Smash, so if you skip that one, you might want to skip this one too. There's your warning, 3, 2, 1. So this is based on the true final boss of FF7, which is Sephiroth's final form known as Safer Sephiroth. The camera angle that appears in this shot is a straight reference to the same angle used in that fight, which you can really tell if you land this Final Smash on 3 characters specifically. And the actual move of Supernova is one of the attacks Sephiroth can use in this fight. I would love to show you the full attack in this video, but that would take up too much time because the full animation is 2 minutes. That's right, it takes around 120 seconds for this move to finish playing, and as you can imagine, it's very strong to say the least. In the original Japanese release of the game, the animation was actually much shorter at only about 30 seconds long, and didn't have a super elaborate cinematic of Sephiroth blowing up a couple planets with a meteorite. That didn't happen until the international release of the game, where the full animation is 4 times as long. This version of the attack is much more iconic, so it makes sense that they would specifically make that his Final Smash. I'm glad that they made it infinitely shorter in Smash, but you know how if you win a match with Joker's Final Smash, the splash screen at the end turns into the victory screen? I always thought it would have been hilarious if when you win with Sephiroth's Final Smash, the same thing would sort of happen, where a remake of the full Supernova animation would play, but then game appears at the start and the result screen just shows up on top of it. The example I used here is from a fan remake I found online, which I have of course linked in the description. It's very well made, go check it out. And at the end of this very long animation, it could just transition into his normal victory screen with the fire and stuff. And one last thing, his Final Smash always inflicts a random status to anyone it hits, which is also what he does in this boss fight, where Supernova can inflict you with the Confuse, Silence, or Slow debuffs. He also has an attack called Pale Horse, which he almost always does before Supernova, and that attack can inflict even more statuses on you, such as turning you into a frog. So personally, I think this Final Smash giving you a bunch of random debuffs is just based on that whole sequence in Final Fantasy VII. Anyways, moving on from one JRPG anime sword character to 2 JRPG anime sword characters. Pyra and Mythra are swap characters like Squirtle, Ivysaur, and Charizard, but unlike them, they actually each get their own Final Smash. Pyra's Final Smash is the very uncreatively named Burning Sword, where Rex shows up to swing her blade, and then the two hold the sword together, jump up for no real reason at all, and then make a huge flame pillar appear. This is just simply based on Pyra's level 4 Blade special with the same name, which also has pretty much the same animation. It also shows up in a few cutscenes, so you could say it's basically her signature move. And Mythra's Final Smash is Sacred Arrow, where they do the same thing at the start with both of them wielding the sword, but instead of jumping up, they point the sword to the sky and make a bunch of light beams shoot down from above. This is similarly just based on Mythra's level 4 Blade special, also with the same name and pretty much the same animation. Sound familiar? Yeah, Pyra and Mythra are known as Blades in Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and a Blade's ultimate attack is usually their level 4 special in battle, which are only available once you've reached maximum affinity in battle with said blade. You can tell when you have max affinity in Xenoblade 2 if your character and their blade start getting a faint yellow glow and a yellow line in between them. This glow and yellow line also show up in Smash, but the line specifically disappears so insanely fast before the cinematic starts that I originally didn't even know it was there, but sure enough, there it is. Rex is the quote-unquote driver of Pyra and Mythra, meaning only he can wield their blades and bond with them. And level 4 specials are always performed by both the blade and the driver, just as you see in Smash. Kazuya Mishima's final smash is Final Blaster, where he shoots a laser from his middle third eye, transforms into a very demonic looking demon, and then shoots a bunch of lasers from his wings and chest. This attack is based on Tekken 7, where in the final fight of Kazuya's story mode, he faces his father Heihachi in the stage Brimstone and Fire, which is at an active volcano. Kazuya has the Devil Gene, which he inherited from his mother, Kasumi Mishima, and in this final boss fight, he gets particularly annoyed at his father and fully transforms into this demonic form for the first time. And during this phase of the fight, Final Blaster becomes his rage art, and he also does it in a cutscene a bit later in the fight, which is what the cutscene for the final Smash is based on. You can even see the stage Brimstone and Fire in the background in Smash during it. And now we're finally at the last character, Sora. His final Smash is called Sealing the Keyhole, where he throws you into a keyhole, which then closes a big door on you with the Smash logo on it, and then Sora points at said door with his Keyblade and turns it to lock the door, and then it explodes. In the Kingdom Hearts games, Sora often has to seal things called keyholes with his Keyblade, which each world has in them, in order to prevent the Heartless from wreaking havoc in said worlds. In the original game, this evil guy gets sucked into, or destroyed by, the Door to Darkness, and then Sora, Goofy, and Donald Duck try their best to close the door by pushing it, while another character, Riku, pulls from the other side, as Mickey Mouse just kinda stands there. After a bit of a struggle, they succeed in closing it, and then Sora and Mickey both lock the door from each side with their respective Keyblades, which then just makes it disappear. The final Smash is believed to be based on this scene specifically, even though the door is way smaller, looks nothing like the Door to Darkness, Donald, Goofy, Riku, and Mickey aren't present, and the door doesn't explode. Now the way I put that makes it seem as if that's not what it's based on, which could very well be the case. There is another idea fans think this final Smash could be inspired by though, which I think is a lot cooler. As I'm sure you know, in Kingdom Hearts, Sora and his friends travel to many different worlds, most notably those of Disney movies, like The Little Mermaid, Monsters Incorporated, Toy Story, etc. Like I said earlier, each of those worlds has a keyhole which Sora seals with his Keyblade to bring peace to those worlds. And in that sense, this final Smash would be him sealing the keyhole of the quote-unquote Smash Brothers world, since it literally has the Smash Brothers logo on it. And also, because he's this game's last character, which they obviously made a big deal out of, this final Smash has him close the door on this game in a metaphorical and literal sense, which is a really cute idea. That would still mean the attack is obviously made up, as Sora has never traveled to this Smash Bros world in Kingdom Hearts, and he also doesn't blow up the keyholes when he's done sealing them, though knowing Kingdom Hearts, it wouldn't surprise me if they tried making the Smash world canon in the upcoming game. I've seen some Kingdom Hearts fans say that even though they're very happy with Sora's inclusion in Smash, they're disappointed by his lack of references to his home series in his moveset, which the final Smash obviously falls under as it's mostly made up. Especially a big shame considering he's the last character, and all other DLC characters had such cool final Smashes. For the most part, at least. Anyway, wow, that's every single final Smash in the history of Smash Bros. Covered. Around 117 actually, give or take, all in one of my longest videos ever. Personally, I think final Smashes are a really cool, if not generic concept. They very clearly aren't all made with the same amount of love, but that's okay. Smash has so many characters now, it's kinda unrealistic to expect that. And either way, they make for some of the coolest references to each fighter's origin games, for the most part. I'm sorry, I just really hate Triforce Slash. Personally, I think it's kinda lame how in Ultimate they made every single Final Smash quick and frankly not very fun to use. I don't think there's a bigger downgrade in the series than Wario Man going from a fully playable and broken character that can fly with his aerials to a goofy cutscene ending on a fart. And while some of the cutscenes are really cool, almost every Final Smash in the game functions the exact same. You press a button, and if an opponent was in front of you, they get hit by a very strong attack that will likely KO them. And that's it. You can't tell me that's more fun than flying around as a giant tank, or being a stupidly strong version of yourself for a short amount of time. The final smash with the most amount of interaction in Ultimate is probably Bayonetta's, with how you slow everything down and then you have to land hits to fill a meter, but even then, once you do that, it just cuts to a cutscene. You can mash during it for more damage, but it's still just a cutscene that acts as one big hit. This overall change to how Final Smashes work was definitely made because of the implementation of the Final Smash meter. I have a theory that the Smash devs were hoping that because you can build it up like a super move in regular fighting games, and they don't disrupt the fast-paced flow of a battle anymore, the competitive Smash scene would use it in their rule sets, and then casual spectators would see these flashy moves happen, which would get crowds hype and thus sell more copies. I mean, why else would they almost always have Final Smash meter on in official Nintendo tournaments? The problem with that is that the Final Smash meter is just fundamentally flawed. In traditional fighting games, you don't just have a meter to build up your super move. You can use parts of the meter to cancel end lag and extend combos, amongst other things. It's more about resource management, and resourceful players will be rewarded with a strong, flashy finisher move. The Final Smash meter doesn't do this. It's a meter you build up over the course of a battle that lets you use a strong move when it's full. And that's it. You can't use parts of it up to do any fancy stuff, you can't steal meter from someone else, it's just a loading screen essentially. Don't get me wrong, in 1v1s I think it's a way better way of getting the Final Smash than fighting over a ball that randomly appears and flies around, but it's not worth reducing every Final Smash to a boring finisher with almost no player input for it, but that's of course assuming my tinfoil hat theory is true. Besides that, when you have Final Smash ready, it replaces your neutral special until you use it, which for some characters is a huge detriment. By far the worst case of this is Shulk. His regular neutral special, Monado Arts, is a way better move than his Final Smash, but when you have access to it, you can't use your arts until you either land it or just waste it. And on top of that, the game tells you that this Final Smash is affected by your current Monado Art, which is true, but good luck getting to make use of that. If you want to give your Final Smash more launch power with his Smash art, you'd have to activate it, then get your Final Smash after that, and then very quickly manage to hit your opponent with it. And in that case, you might actually get that benefit. Probably not though, because the timer of the art doesn't pause during the Final Smash, and they don't last very long, meaning it's way more likely to run out before the final hit that actually sends your opponent flying. What the hell kind of game design is that? There is a workaround for this in Ultimate, which is to do a directional special and then hold the special button during it, because that will open up the Monado dial after the move. But this is clearly an oversight, and something your opponent isn't likely to just let you do. And moreover, this wasn't possible in Smash 4 because the dial didn't exist yet. Sorry for the rant, I just personally don't think the system is very well designed or fun in Ultimate specifically, but I still appreciate them for the references they bring and their neat animations. I'll just always prefer how they worked in Brawl and Smash 4. I quickly want to thank SmashWiki.com. Even though I run an information-based YouTube channel, I usually try my best not to resort to the site in any of my videos, but I'm of course not familiar with every single franchise in Smash's playable roster, so for some of them I got pretty much all my info from the pages of the characters' Final Smashes on that website. Not all of them by any means, but for a lot of them I did at least fact check what I said on those pages, so my thanks goes out to whoever wrote those. You all really saved my bacon. Let me know what your favorite Final Smash is. Mine is Smash 4's Wario Man for obvious reasons, but if we're just talking Ultimate, then it's definitely Joker's All Out Attack. I'm not even a huge Persona 5 fan or something, but it's just so flashy and accurate to its source material, and it gets big bonus points for being able to transition into the result screen. You all know how much I love that part about it. My least favorite Final Smash is easily Shulk's, for plenty of reasons. It was perfectly fine in Smash 4, but I really think they ruined it in Ultimate. Call me a baby, it's just how I feel. Wanna know something I don't hate though? My awesome Patreon supporters. Big huge giant thanks to CPJ, LurFX1, Super Big Eggs, The Game Diddy, Giant Firing Coal, Milk and Frogs, Right the Yoshi, Herc, The Flying Fire, Sylveon700, Quote is Cool, Lime the Chef, Sheen for the Win, Noso, and the rest of my lovely supporters. Thank you guys so much for your continued support. This was a huge project, literally years in the making, so I'm glad it's finally done now. Can't wait to do it again for the next Smash game. But until then, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.